As I mentioned earlier, one of the big problems was there was no grand theory out there. I was going to have to construct it from the little pieces of the puzzle that each of these scientists offered. And it became apparent to me as I did so that what I was looking at was a radical new view of the world that described a completely different way of how our world works, of how we work and how we define ourselves. It came about from frontier scientists who had asked a couple of questions that were important about what hadn't been completed in quantum theory. They also asked the obvious question, why are there two kinds of physics? These days, there's the physics of the small, which is the physics of quantum physics, and the physics of the very large. That's the big observable world out there. And most physicists are content to believe that quantum particles behave one way when they're on their own as a tiny particle, but behave entirely differently as a part of a collective whole, as a big thing. So these scientists were brave enough to ask those questions. Can nature be this messy and redundant to have two kinds of physics? They also were looking at things like, what is consciousness? Where is it? Is it in the brain? And they wondered about our role and the role of consciousness and whether it can extend out and affect its world. And later in this program, I'll be looking at the individual contributions of these scientists. I realized in trying to put all their material together that I was looking at a new paradigm of the universe that was underpinned by a dynamic cobweb of information encoded in an energy field that connected everything in its invisible web, and that the universe existed as a relationship. It wasn't a collection of individual things on this lonely planet, in this lonely universe, but it was about things affecting other things at every moment. I also realized that we, as conscious beings, were at the very center of this process as creators of our own universe, and that maybe there wasn't an out there anymore, that out there was all part of me, and that we were all an integral part of this information exchange. The other question they asked concerned the so-called observer effect in quantum theory. And this is the well-known effect in all quantum experiments. It has to do with the fact that quantum particles are not one set thing. Any quantum entity is all of its possible selves all at the same time. It's a little bit like something being, instead of an individual seat, the entire stadium. Or it's like looking at yourself in a hall of mirrors. It's all possible selves all at the same time. And all quantum physicists know that this unreconstructed thing becomes a set thing as soon as someone observes it or takes a measurement. But few scientists ever ask the question of whether or not the observer effect occurs in real life. Does this mean that all of reality exists in this kind of unconstructed state and that we create our reality as we observe it? This was a really difficult process for me because it was like pulling a little piece of string and finding a bit more and then going a bit further and a bit further. I would start with one scientist and he would tell me some pretty amazing things, but then there'd be a lot of other questions I would have from that, and I would have to think a bit more about, well, okay, where does that lead me? And then I would have to follow on from there and say, right, and how does that work in the human body? And then if that's the case, what does this mean about cell communication? Or what does this mean about how our brains work? And is the mind encased inside the brain, as most neuroscientists would say? And what does this mean about our extended human potential? And so it became more and more of a string-pulling exercise until I felt I had enough material to start assembling it. The other really difficult thing about this was that these guys talk in code. If you've ever talked to a quantum physicist, you'll understand that their method of communicating with each other is through math. They write equations. And so for them to say this in language that's understandable to a non-scientist like me was very difficult. I had to, in many cases, talk to them in analogies. I'd have to say to them things like, if I understand you correctly, it's like this, and I would create a metaphor, and they would have to say, yeah, it's a bit like that. And so that's how we got to talk to each other. We talked to each other in metaphors. But I was also conscious of being a non-scientist. I am also a very careful reporter, and I wanted to make sure what I was saying was correct. So when I finished writing, I sent the relevant portions back to all of the scientists to carefully check to make sure that what I'd turned into plain layman's English was also correct. One of the first things I had to think about was how to start and where to start. And many people that I came across all pointed to Edgar Mitchell. Now, Mitchell is an American hero and a celebrity. He was the sixth man on the moon and one of the crew members of Apollo 14. He narrowly escaped being on Apollo 13. And in fact, if you've seen the movie, he was the guy in the simulator who helped to bring the module back after it had had its fire. Mitchell had an experience, and his experience really informed me about what I was looking for, because I hadn't even known where to start, or when I was first doing this, I didn't even know what I was looking for. Mitchell had had an amazing experience when he was in outer space and coming home from landing on the moon. He was in the little Kitty Hawk, which was circulating around, and he was looking through the window, looking at Earth. And while he was there, he had this, what could only be described as an epiphany, a feeling that he was reaching out through the cosmos, and every molecule in his being was connected with everything else. And he felt himself extending out, almost like he was extending out through the window. And he had this image and a total sense of connectivity. It wasn't a spiritual feeling. It wasn't like he'd seen the face of God. He just had this utter sense and certainty of connection. And that, for me, was the kernel of the whole thing. How to find a science that could describe this connection. I was certain that he was right. It was the only way that something like spiritual healing or homeopathy could work, a science that could explain an invisible connection between things. And it was just trying to find a mechanism for what Ed Mitchell had experienced that was the first thing I had to think about.